Welcome to the World 101x second and final live stream discussion. Today we're joined by Gerhard Hofstadter, Anna Christina Pertiera and Sally Babbage, who you'll recognise from the last 3 episodes of the World 101x course. And that was the module that was looking at life within limits. So we began with Sally's episode in the Atacama Desert in Chile before moving to Cuba with Anna, and our final episode, which has just been released this last week, was with Gerhard, looking at the plight of refugees in Malaysia. So during this live stream episode, we're going to be posing a few questions that have been posted on the World 101x discussion board, and thank you all for submitting such great questions and upvoting certain ones of them. So we'll get through as many of them as we can. But we also encourage your participation during the live stream itself. So don't forget that you can post on our discussion board, which will be live. You can also tweet at us, and our handle is @World101x, or you can post under the YouTube video on the YouTube platform. So we're going to start with a question that came up in a few different forms on the discussion board, and this is a question that I'll put to each of the 3 of you. But a few people wanted to know about the practical applications of anthropology. So this is a question that was well worded by C. Fatima, who asks, besides educating us to better understand each other and show us other realities, how can anthropology help people solve issues such as water scarcity, for example, in a more effective way? Which is the practice adopted to help? I wonder if any of you would like to open the discussion on that note.
I'll begin, I guess. I saw the question. I had a couple of different thoughts in my head, and one was that in writing in academic fora, and writing about cultural diversity and the way in which different groups of people deal with material scarcity, for example, the way we write about that both theoretically and practically in academic fora, I guess helps in the world in terms of knowledge. But then also, I think the way in which we think about things in the field with people, so the way in which we listen to the way people deal with material scarcity in our field work, and then the way we kind of analyse on the ground with people by asking them questions and saying, so is it like this? The way in which we're asked to take part also in community meetings about certain kinds of material scarcity, or take part in meetings and express our opinion when we're in the field, often has practical effects as well.
So what I'm understanding from what you're saying is that has implications for the people with whom you're living as an anthropologist over the course of your field work, right? And I wonder if, I know that Gerhard, you mentioned in your episode that a part of the anthropology that you do is about bearing witness to people's struggles in Malaysia. So I wonder if you might be able to comment on that, being involved with the people in your field site, and how that has practical upshots.
I think it's a good question, but actually it's not always the role of the anthropologist to help per se. I think what we do is often not directly knowable as help. It's not that we often, the suffering is so immediate, and there's so much of it, and we feel empathy and we want to help, but we can't help everybody. So the question is, as anthropologists, what can we do, and what do we do with the skills that we have? And the skills that we have is writing about it, as you say, Sally. And for me, bearing witness is actually taking those stories and bringing them to other people and making them aware of what's happening in Malaysia. And actually, a lot of discussion in the discussion forum were actually saying, well, I didn't know this was happening in Malaysia. And whenever I hear that, that's really important to me, because if I feel like I'm doing something in getting these stories out. And I think that in itself is also the role of any academic in educating the students we have here and the students, everyone on World 101x. Educating other people is, I wouldn't term it helping per se. I think helping is almost a bit patronizing, that, in terms of the power relations. But I think it's doing something. And I think it's an important aspect of the academic, educating the people in our classes, but also working with the people we work with in the field, and getting those messages out to a broader public out there.
So this is great, because there are a few questions that were posted on the discussion board that relate to the sorts of fora through which you can disseminate the knowledge that you've gained through anthropological inquiry. So there's one here that I think links really well to the point you were just making, Gerhard, and this one's from Kiabet, who asks, my question, what are you doing to spread your knowledge? How can you go mainstream, and by which means of media can you effectively communicate? So I'm wondering if maybe we could start with Anna this time.
Yeah, well, I guess it really flows on from the previous question. Thinking about the work that I do to communicate what I find in Cuba, for example, I am really interested in telling stories about the people that I know there and the ideas that I generate from my interactions and my relationships with those people. But definitely the way I mostly tell those stories is through my own quite academic writing and also through my teaching. So, as Gerhard was mentioning, communicating with students is one of the ways that's really important that we communicate these ideas. And I am quite happy, I think it's quite important to be a person who tells stories in quite a complicated way, to not always only simplify those stories or make them short or accessible in a sort of a media-friendly way. So that's okay for me to do that in my academic writing. But what I find is, especially on a topic like Cuba, where there are a lot of people who are interested in the political and economic context there are lots of films that are made, lots of documentaries, radio shows, popular books, novels, films. When other people are communicating about Cuba in other ways, they find my approach interesting for them because it is this more complicated and perhaps more detailed, less immediately digestible way of telling that story. So my role as an anthropologist is not always to communicate that work in a directly active, popular way, but I try to make it accessible enough to be of use to people who are interested in translating my anthropological work into a more popular audience. Yeah.
Do either of you have any comments to make in response to that? So walking this line between making the information you're generating accessible but still retaining enough of the complexity that it still has a sense of honesty about it? I mean, how do you negotiate that sort of balance?
It's a difficult line to find, and having written in both ways, either for reports to the community, to a community of people, to a group of people who aren't necessarily, educated above primary school level, so providing community reports in plain language, or writing academic material, and both of them kind of being able to, I guess, get enough complexity so that you get across the way in which people live their lives in those really complex ways, without simplifying, without making it too digestible, because you know, it's that sort of, it does it seems to contradict the way in which we humans live our lives, but being able to then put across some of that into a plain language history report or a community report or something like that.
Gerhard?
I don't. I think it's actually two different things in some respects. Writing for, let's say, a broader audience is writing in quite a different way than writing to an academic audience. And I think it's really important what you mentioned, Anna. Theory, right? Anthropologists also produce theory, and theory transcends just our field and just whatever we're working on. And as you say, it helps other people think about whatever they're working in other places, and I think that's really important too. We shouldn't neglect and always say we have to popularize what we're doing and neglect theory. So I think that's really important. But I think that they're almost two different projects, and I write in very different ways, in a different mode of thinking when I write for different audiences. That's.
Just in case you've tuned in, you're on the WORLD101x live stream, and don't forget that you can participate as we're speaking. So if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to put to Gerhard, Sally or Anna, feel free to participate via the discussion board that's through the WORLD101x MOOC platform, or you can tweet at us, at WORLD101x is our handle, or leave a comment under the YouTube video. So we've been talking a lot about the role that anthropologists can play in terms of getting their knowledge to a broader audience. But there's also a question that came through about practical engagements in the field. So this one has just come through in the last day or so from Shimink, who asks, I wonder if Gerhard can elaborate more on how he supported the Refugee Community Project, and also if Sally could elaborate on the case that the mining company and local community live in peace, such that both parties are happy with the water arrangement and environmental issues surrounding the mining industry. Also, I wonder if in Cuba there is advocacy or change in terms of good distribution, given the anthropological works there, Anna. So I'm wondering if maybe we'll start with Gerhard.
Look, there's a range of practical applications beyond writing about it. One project I helped out with was the first refugee community annual report, which we produced in the refugee community I was staying with and working with, to create more transparency in terms of how they were dealing with, the income they were generating, both to donors like the UNHCR and to their own community. And wherever I live, I help out in very normal ways of wherever you live. You buy stuff, you help out the family you're staying with. I think there's also taking those stories back to Australia, and Australia has this relationship with Southeast Asia and refugees in particular, and I try to in some way impact policy. It's very, very difficult, but I think writing for the press, going to certain community forums where the government seeks counsel, sometimes they do, and writing submissions to different government agencies can help. I'm not saying it makes huge strides, but all these things chip away, hopefully, at certain perceptions, which I think is something I'm trying to do.
Sally, any comments?
Well, certainly, I mean, in most contexts, even where on the surface there is a kind of peace between mining extraction and indigenous communities, as is the case where I work in Chile. There is still tension and negotiation and levels of distaste about extraction of water from people's feelings of distaste about extraction of water from their country, from their territory, as well as a constant sort of battle by the social and environmental performance team of mining companies, who are there to I guess manage that relationship with the community, and also to kind of convince the mining company, who are not one whole thing, but a number of different areas, a number of different kinds of groups within these companies. So you have engineers wanting to extract water, and you have social and environmental performance people trying to convince them that they have to stay within the contract that they have with local communities. So there are these kinds of things going on. And so as an anthropologist involved in listening to meetings between Indigenous people and mining companies, what's interested me is the way in which the social and environmental performance team are interested to hear and are keen to take back to the company different understandings of what's going on the ground and what's going on in terms of their relationship with the community. So, and they've been interested to hear my interpretation as the anthropologist watching and witnessing what's going on. So on that level, there's a kind of immediate reporting back as an anthropologist, a kind of witnessing that you were talking about before, Gerhard. But also, writing and publishing about the work where it's possible.
Do you think that those relationships that you're describing, I mean, that you sit in meetings and observe these relationships be negotiated between mining companies and Indigenous people, for instance, do you think that those relationships play out differently because you're there? I mean, are you aware of the effect that your presence might have?
I think that's important for an anthropologist in any context, to be reflexive about their presence and what their presence creates in any context. And certainly I notice a kind of difference. I notice a kind of noticing of me as people speak to each other. And I've been told by different people that, by Indigenous people, for example, that they are treated differently by by certain visitors. They're treated more respectfully when there's a witness present. So I guess it's true. It's true on some of those observations, but then I've also you always notice as an anthropologist that you are there, surprisingly.
And Anna, does any of your work in Cuba tackle advocacy around goods distribution?
No, in a word, no. None of the work that I do in Cuba is part of an advocacy, is taking on an advocacy role. For one reason for that is that they don't need me as an advocate. There may well be there are many examples of work that anthropologists do where the people they are working with have great use for advocacy, and often, many of the most exciting areas of anthropological work are about negotiating that relationship in a situation where advocacy is useful for the local community, and how to do that in a way that also creates good anthropology for universities and theory. But in my case, in Cuba, Cuban people have no need of my advocacy in that area. The Cuban government is highly organised, and although there are considerable problems with distributing goods, there are shortages in certain areas, Cubans themselves on the ground are very adept at managing the outcomes of those areas of scarcity, and the Cuban government is very adept at managing the resources as best they can. There are many other people who do the kind of policy related work, and there are also many people on the ground who work very hard to produce livings, to negotiate relationships that mean that they have their needs met. So the only way in which I'm having an impact on that is just as a human being there, that with my friends and my neighbours. Obviously, as a person in that community, if we're having a party, I help out, and when I need some help, they help me. And so as a person there, there's this reciprocal arrangement, but I would never describe my work there as advocacy.
Interestingly, and just on this note of working with these sorts of communities, I think that a theme that comes up in the work of all three of you is the relationship between the communities you work with and the state, in whatever form that might take. And there's an excellent question has come through from SCFR 45 that asks exactly about that. So they ask, when it's not the case, or rather, how can anthros continue to champion the truth and the interests of people while still remaining on the government's good side, if that's something that you need to take into account, so that the work may continue? Does it even matter? Is the role, influence and power of the state just another anthropological variable? So I know that you all work in very different fields in terms of the power and organisation of the state, and I'm wondering if maybe we could go back and start with you, Gerhard. How do you deal with the presence of the state in your field work?
Oh, it's omnipresent. But I think I don't have to stay on the good side of the state, and it doesn't... it's at the back of my mind, I guess, not to do something so outrageous that they would never allow me back in, which has happened. I think, is it Nigel Barley has wrote this book about his time in Cameroon, I think, and anthropologists per se were expelled from the country, not allowed back for many years after. So it has happened, and it happens. I think with my work, because refugees are under the radar and in an extra legal state, the state doesn't take too much notice, as you know, and as long as I don't do something that would jeopardize the state itself, I don't think I would get into too much trouble. I've been stopped by the police and the usual thing that happens, but not to the extent that I would be conscious of having to write in a certain way because the state might read it. And I think that's another issue. A lot of states or people working for the state don't read what we write, and therefore there's little danger of them. I mean, otherwise I probably wouldn't be allowed back to Malaysia after if they'd read my book, but I have, so they haven't, and so it's all good. So I don't think it's a big issue for many anthropologists, but it's something, because we also write about the state, it's something that we're interested in. So how the state treats us when we have to go and visit the state for research permits or for interviews, all kinds of things. I think we try to be reflective about our relationship with the state that we work in.
Could I just jump in and say there as well, though, that as anthropologists, it's important for us to not have a very simplistic understanding of this big thing called the state. I mean, there are some common issues we could find across many different places in terms of how to work with government institutions, and with people who work for government institutions. But you know, the state, although it seems like this kind of powerful, invisible structure that governs so much, is our experiences of the state is more likely to be individual encounters with visa officers, with bureaucrats, with border officials, with local academic institutions, with local government authorities for different community groups. And that is a more complicated experience than to just talk about the state.
And there are all these contradictions, right,
Yeah.
within the state.
Of course.
And we're on either side or both sides of
course.
all these internal
Of course.
contradictions. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Sally, any words on that?
When I first started working in northern Chile, I thought I was interested in studying the state as part of the framing of who is indigenous. So the state recognises indigenous people through enacting a law, the indigenous law, and this kind of creates this category of indigenous people. The people were there already, and they'd always been there, which is why they were called indigenous. But you know, the state creates this category, and so I was interested in studying the state. What became quite clear was that the state was largely absent in its normal forms, the types of forms that you just kind of reeled off, you know, government, bureaucracy, state, you know, functionaries, local functionaries. There is municipal government, local government, and so on. But these oasis towns largely govern themselves. They are a state themselves, and so that became quite interesting. What are the processes of local authority that create the state, that create local political authority, that create a kind of sense of organising life into the future and structuring life into the future in both political and kind of bureaucratic terms as well, local bureaucratic terms. But this Chilean state is there, even though it seems to be absent, and it's there very much in an enabling way. It's a neoliberal state, and so it opens up the possibility for corporate extraction and activity in northern Chile, and so it's both very much absent and very much present, and that's I guess my interest in the state in that particular research.
It's interesting, it seems like all three of you have had quite different experiences of finding the state in your field and what that looks like, and it sounds like it's complex and that there's this multiplicity of ways in which the state presents itself. But I'm wondering if you might be able to also speak to whether or not you seek out an engagement with the state, whichever state that might be, as a part of your work. So going back to this idea of advocacy that's often really problematic in anthropological fieldwork, I know that a few people have asked, particularly about your work with refugees, Gerhard, to what extent does your work as an engaged anthropologist, let's say, drive you to engage with the state directly, or to use your agency to contact the state rather than just finding the state in your fieldwork?
Like Anna, I think, you know, Malaysia doesn't need me to tell Malaysians and the Malaysian state how to treat refugees. There is a human rights organization or couple, so that's not my role there. I see my role more here in Australia, and in telling people here about a refugee crisis in our region that most people aren't aware of because it's being hidden from them at the border. Because our state is very big on border protection and policing that border and keeping a lot of problems out of sight. And I guess I see my role in educating people or telling people about what is happening on the other side of the ocean in this case. So my relationship in a way is probably more with the Australian state than with the Malaysian state. And you know, as a foreigner, as a non-Malaysian, it's very hard to actually engage on that level unless they wanted to know from an expert, you know. I think it'd be very hard to have a moral judgment or or bring anything else to bear on the Malaysian state that, as I've written, has on occasion risen to to accept hundreds of thousands of refugees. Just at the moment, like in a lot of countries around the world, the refugee is seen as this internal other, to be expelled or to be treated in a bad way, to be scapegoated, and that's often used for domestic policies. So it's nothing different there, I guess, but I don't see my role as intervening in Malaysia with the state.
There is a really good question as well that's been posted for you, Anna, about the relationship between local communities and the state, specifically in Cuba. So this one comes from M. Windervoxel. I hope I pronounced that correctly. But they say what I found really interesting in week 6 is that the few Cubans that were interviewed did not express a political opinion or any dissatisfaction with the system they live in. More than posting a question, I'd like to know a little more about how the material culture in Cuba can manifest resistance or dissent on their current political and economic situation.
Well, I guess that's a great comment, because it's picking up on one of the points that's really at the heart of some of the work I've done around material culture in Cuba, which is to suggest that we can't assume that a lack of goods and complaining about a lack of goods is necessarily complaining about the Cuban system. So behind that argument that I make in the Cuban context is a desire to stop people from assuming that socialism always equals this very simple view of socialism is a scarcity of goods, and everybody in that socialist system hates the socialist government, and when they complain about having nothing in the shops, that what they're doing is critiquing socialism. So my argument is that is not necessarily happening, right? But certainly, of course, there are a lot of people who are very dissatisfied with their lives in Cuba. That is absolutely evident. There's no secret. And there are some people who believe that significant economic reform and market reform would alleviate many of those tensions. Now, a lot of people would like to retain aspects of the socialist system, particularly around healthcare and education, although they see that even these areas that have traditionally been the strength of the Cuban system are also a little bit shaken by the realities of kind of 21st century economic difficulties. But my point about material culture in that context is that at the domestic level, at a family level, as well as at a national level, it's a space in which people can have a diversity of opinions and perspectives and debates through their own very intimate feelings about the goods that they have or the goods that they don't have. They express all sorts of positions about their family relationships, about their attitudes to the government, which are complicated and diverse as they are in any part of the world, but also about their feelings for the future. And so we can't just say that when people talk about their refrigerators that they're talking about politics, and that they're talking about politics in one way or another. So it's a tool for me to open up all these different things that they might be talking about and feeling. Yeah, does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And in fact, there's a thing that you mentioned about picking up on the way that people talk about goods and their political organisation at that local level. That's been posed as a question in a different way. So this is changing tack, but only just slightly. And this is a question that's been submitted by T, who asks, says to start off with, I'm currently also taking a course on sustainability and have found many of the topics discussed in the Living Within Limits section to cross over in subject matter. So this makes for a richer experience in learning the two simultaneously, but also raises a couple of questions. So what T would like to ask is, 1, are sustainable practices in ethnic groups studied? If so, are these practices more traditional or influenced by outsiders, both groups and individuals? And 2, are sustainable methods shared among researchers or simply recorded for future reference? So I'm not sure if any of the three of you have something to say to that.
Well, sustainability as a term has gained great currency in the last, 10 years. And it to such an extent that the work that I do, for example, looks at how, in some ways, looks at how mining companies use this term sustainability in various ways. They use the term sustainability to talk about the economic sustainability of their extraction of ore from the ground. They also use it to talk about the way in which they can help economically sustain impacted communities in their region, in the region where they operate, where they extract. They also sustainability in a way that is more familiar to kind of environmental discourse, to talk about environmental sustainability despite their impact, the impact of their activity. So it's a term that's kind of, that's a little bit, you know, a little bit shifty, and it's a term that I think we need to question its use all the time. But in terms of anthropologists studying sustainable practice undertaken by different communities, sure. For example, anthropologists have studied the way in which Andean communities have organised the use of water through irrigation practices to use what is a very scarce resource. For example, and organised it in ritual terms, in sort of structural and legal terms, in ceremonial terms, and so on. And so that's one example. We can talk about the way in which anthropologists in the past, I guess it was a way of thinking about sustainability, but in different terms. The way in which anthropologists, I guess functionalist anthropologists, thought about the way in which different domains of small-scale society function together in order to sustain a particular model of society and culture. Slightly different tack, though. A slightly different tack. But when this question about sort of thinking about, do anthropologists study this? Well, I guess we do, but I guess there is a lot of questioning of the term sustainability, and we can take it literally and we can think back to functionalism, or we can sort of question the way in which that term has currency in the world today.
Anna, I imagine sustainability could be a term that has some kind of place in the work that you do in material culture as well. Would that be right?
Yeah, I mean, most of the people that I work with in Cuba don't use the word sustainability very much in their everyday speech, but there is a lot of reuse and recycling and extensive adaptation of existing material goods that happens there in ways that are often very creative, because if you can't buy lots of new consumer goods, you have to endlessly reuse all sorts of things that might seem quite simple. In a lot of other societies that are perhaps capitalist societies but that may be quite poor, a plastic bag would still be considered to be rubbish in this day and age. But in Cuba, because of the shortage of plastic bags, people will retain them and reuse them in all sorts of ways. Often for a long time they'll wash them, they will keep them for as long as the plastic bag doesn't disintegrate, to reuse in all sorts of ways. And for an outsider, those sorts of practices seem to be quite admirable examples of trying to create a more sustainable society. Of course, for people on the ground, some of those people would frankly rather have access to a lot of plastic bags. But there is a lot of work around. That's a good example, a very small example of how we could think about all of the complications of do we impose this term of sustainability on top of these practices that are really on the ground feeling more like adaptive solutions, inventive solutions to a problem of scarcity? What do government policies do to manage these sorts of situations? How do people talk about them and feel about them? So certainly those are issues that I'm very interested in, but in the Cuban context, I wouldn't normally see that primarily through the sort of phrase sustainability.
Gerhard, you work with communities that don't necessarily have access to a lot of material possessions in the same way that other communities do. Is that a term that's come up for you in your work, or less so in terms of your anthropological focus?
Not at all. And Malaysia is actually, it's sort of, they have the vision 2020. By 2020, they want to be fully industrialized. And so there's an abundance of shopping bags, for instance. So I think, and everyone has them. So refugees are no different there. And to think of refugees always in terms of scarcity is also not correct, because the latest piece I've written about work, a lot of refugees actually find jobs that other Malaysians don't even have access to, actually, and they actually earn decent incomes, and certainly enough to remit back to Myanmar or to other countries where they're from. That's a minority, but that exists too. That's part of the diversity of the refugee experience. So to always think of them as only living in suffering and is not right either. So some of them are living it up, going to clubs and singing karaoke at night. That's not the common experience, but it also happens. So, and I think that's one thing anthropologists bring to the table. It's actually talking about the diversity of experiences of how people live their lives and translating that to sometimes a broader audience. But I think inherent in the question is also the problem that we probably don't do it enough. The question that, is this information available? Well, most of the stuff we write is still behind paywalls, only accessible to other people at other universities. And I think that is an issue academia is grappling with.
Actually, sorry, go on, Anna.
Oh, it's actually to state, I'd love us to come back and talk about this issue of paywalls and how to access material, but I was interested in, it's an interesting example to put side by side a refugee in Malaysia and a person in Cuba, and to use those as two examples of how hard it is to measure things that we've been talking about, like scarcity and suffering and sustainability, because in fact they have different ways in which they're experiencing some levels of abundance and some levels of scarcity and some levels of satisfaction and some levels of suffering. So in the Malaysian context, there are all sorts of legal difficulties and some economic difficulties, or certainly political difficulties, but there's not a question of access to consumer goods, and in the Cuban context there are high levels of education, very good levels of health, but some real challenges around experiences of some aspects of poverty that most people elsewhere in the world don't have to experience. And that's one of the great things that this kind of inherently comparative anthropological project does, is make it difficult to generalise about what it is that poverty is, what it is that suffering is, what it is that sustainability is.
What it is that indigeneity
right,
is,
and
these sorts of questions.
Right, this is a very basic aspect of what the anthropological project is, I think.
Yeah.
But we should go back and talk about paywalls.
But actually that's why that last module is called Life Within Limits, based on Michael Jackson's work. And both Michael Jackson and Paul Stoller, who featured in the earlier episode, they both work and have worked with the concept of well-being, because they weren't convinced, both working in Africa, these measures of wealth, poverty, that the UN comes out with numerical values. Well, this country is below here and this country is up. Didn't gel with their experience of working in Sierra Leone, and so for them, they use storytelling, other devices, to get across abundance in some respects and scarcity in others, but that are not immediately not understandable, but not as easily graspable, I guess, from where most of us are coming from, living in a Western capitalist society.
There's actually one of the questions that came through on the discussion board prior to this live stream was from Confused. Aren't we all?
Name.
Isn't it just? Who asked, how is wealth being defined, a wealth of what? And I wonder if you might be able to speak to not only that question, but also perhaps if over the course of your fieldwork, if your understanding of wealth and poverty and just what that means has changed.
I think it's a particularly apposite question for a mining context, and especially where you have a small community dealing with a large mining corporation and extraction within territory that they understand as theirs, or right next door, as in some cases. I understand you spoke to Alex Gollop as well as part of this. So his work in Papua New Guinea is quite different to where I work in Chile, but still communities dealing with the expectation of wealth, of money and employment and consumer goods that a mining economy will bring to their doorstep, to be able to buy a car and have a nice house and all of this kind of wealth. And yet the kind of diminishing control of their lives that wealth brings, so the inability to necessarily have their community around them when they're undertaking the agricultural practices, because people are at work. So not even talking about actual money wealth, but the wealth of having family around you at particular times. The change of time zones, because mining, the mining economy operates on a shift basis. And so you no longer have the weekend, or you no longer have particular time frames in which community happens. So that kind of, that shifts as well. And so people talk about being richer than ever in where I work, you know. They talk about being able to get jobs. All a young man has to do these days is step out the front door and you could get a job. You know, that was a long way to a job before. And so there's that kind of wealth, and yet also a kind of nostalgia and a kind of sadness for the wealth of having people around, more tradition, or more kind of ritual and ceremonial practice, more eating together, those sorts of things. So what, you know, these different, I guess that's just one comparison.
Anna, has that shifted for you over the course of your fieldwork?
I think it has. I think my own perceptions of my own wealth have changed a lot across the course of spending a lot of time in Cuba, and I think that, I think I had said in some of the time that Gerhard was with me in Cuba that I hadn't realised until I spent significant time in a socialist society, I hadn't realised how deeply capitalist logic penetrated my own being. And so that is always a revelation for me, and continues every time I'm back in Cuba to surprise me in different sorts of ways. But I think beyond my own experience in Cuba, I certainly think that, you know, Cubans have an ongoing project in terms of thinking about how they have well-being, but then what they lack. And that's changed over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And so different stages of recent Cuban history have provoked in them quite different feelings of doing well or not doing so well. And now what we find there is that there's at least a perception, and I think it's also backed up by data, that there's a greater polarisation in Cuba today of levels of poverty and or well-being than there were previously. And so that creates a lot of challenges, especially for people who feel that they're being left a bit behind, but also for the people who are doing better in the ways that Sally, not so different to the ways that Sally described.
Have there been any surprises for you, Gerhard, in terms of how you think about the word wealth?
Always surprises coming back from fieldwork. But I think one thing is everything's relative. And I think for me the biggest revelation, I've written about that in the op-ed I put out, has been about, one thing I knew was for refugees the biggest thing is access to identification, and then access to healthcare, education, employment, etc. But really one thing most of us take for granted is we have access to movement. We can move from not just within the country but then to other countries with relative ease. Especially if we're privileged enough to have an Australian passport. I'm not. You know, you can travel visa-free to lots of countries around the world. You just hop on a plane and off you go. Now, for refugees in Malaysia, they're there technically, according to Malaysian law, illegally. They don't have that freedom of movement. In fact, every time they leave their house, they're putting themselves in danger of being detained and either having to pay money or ending up in detention centers. So, movement. And again, it's something we don't think about. You know, opening the door and walking out the house is, we don't have to think about what that means, the lack of potentiality of this sort of movement, everyday movement, as well as the bigger picture movement. You know, we can take up a job anywhere and just move there. Those are dreams for them. And the dream for them is resettlement. And there's so many stages they have to go through in order to fulfill that dream. And by that time, they've built up a fantasy. And so they're often disappointed coming here or elsewhere when the fantasy doesn't, you know, fulfill itself. And I think that's, you know, crushing sometimes to realize that they just don't have that sense of, the possibility of everyday movement.
While we're on your work in Malaysia, actually, there was a couple of people wanting to know, well, this question was posed by KP Menon, who said, I found the videos on Malaysian refugees very interesting, and I was just wondering, what were Gerhard's reasons for studying them? Was he commissioned by the Malaysians or by the university? Or something else?
I wasn't commissioned by anyone. One of the great privileges, again, what a privilege, working at a university as an anthropologist, is that we can mostly do the kind of work we want to do, right? And I worked in Malaysia previously around identity politics of the majority, Malays and in Islam, and I didn't actually know about all these refugees who happened to be in Malaysia. I knew about lots of foreign workers who come to Malaysia working in lots of different places, but I was unaware for a long time about refugees. And once I'd met one, I wanted to know more. And I think that's a common sort of anthropological story of once we find something out, we sort of sniff out, something that we were unaware of, and we want to know more and more, and then one research project leads to the next and the next. And so I've been doing that for a couple of years now.
Someone in a similar vein wanted to know about UNHCR and their position on refugees in Malaysia, but I'd actually like to broaden this question out because there was someone else who anonymously asked how the anthropological perspective and international systems like the UN or like the UNHCR relate to one another. So I wonder if that's something that all three of you would like to speak to. Not at once, obviously.
Well, there are certainly anthropologists who work in all of those major organisations. There are anthropology graduates who work for the UNHCR, who work for the World Bank, who work for the United Nations.
The current head of the World Bank is an anthropologist.
Right, was trained in anthropology. And so they certainly have a presence among many other trained social scientists and other sorts of people in those organisations. I think when you look at how universities or how university-based anthropologists interact with those major institutions, there are examples of productive collaborations, and then there are examples of really critical approaches that anthropologists take to the effects that those sorts of organisations have. And so another luxury of being based in a university, as Gerhard was mentioning, is that the anthropologists who really feel strongly about being critical of how those organisations work have a space in which they can produce work that is sometimes openly, I was going to say hostile, but I don't necessarily mean hostile, but are opposing many aspects of those organisations. I don't think we can say that anthropologists take one single position on what those institutions should be doing.
And they're everywhere.
So institutions,
anthropologists. I mean, in many of
graduates,
these,
certainly,
and many of these different kinds of institutions, from corporations and high up in, I guess referring to my own work, high up in mining corporations, the big names in the world like Rio Tinto and BHP Billiton have anthropologists that work in those companies, as do anthropologists in international, well-funded international environmental mining watch type NGOs. Work for them and publish in both academic and public fora. So, they're active in many different places.
I think the UNHCR is still driven by the legal constructs that they're based upon, the convention and the protocol. So I think the vast number of people there working there are more concerned with the law and how that should operate in different member countries, and even countries who are not members like Malaysia. So I think there's probably more lawyers still there. But as you said, I think anthropologists have had a bigger role to play in institutions like UNESCO for obvious reasons. It's to do with education and culture. So anthropologists were, from the beginning, were more embedded in that and in debates around what they should be doing. But yeah, they are everywhere, so we can find them everywhere.
I think that's about all we've got time for in terms of responding to these questions that have been posted through the discussion board. So I just wonder, before we wrap it up, if any of the three of you have any final comments on any of the questions that have been posed or any aspects of the course.
I think that one of the things that's been very interesting about this course has been that students have an opportunity to reflect on how anthropology is done in the contemporary world. And I think a lot of the questions that have attracted the most popularity and a lot of the questions that students seem to be most interested in show us as teachers that students always want to learn more about how anthropologists do anthropology, and that's been very useful for me to see, and it's something that I think it's great that these sorts of exchanges provide more opportunities for students to talk to us about not just the methods but the practices and experiences of being an anthropologist today.
In fact, it's given us a chance, as I think you commented before, it's given us a chance as anthropologists to think about what other anthropologists do as well.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, always being kind of reflective as an anthropologist is also thinking about your own practice and what other things you can add to it. So looking into other anthropologists' world like yours and Gerhard's
Yeah, that's right.
has been really fun.
And it's been the greatest privilege for me to actually go and visit you guys in the field and bear witness to how anthropologists work. And I think that's been part of the whole course, or the reason behind the course, is to show students what we do and how we do it. And I think looking at some of the student responses, one thing that kept coming up has been anthropology beyond anthropology as a discipline at university, anthropology as applied anthropology, anthropology as engaged, public anthropology. What are the different roles anthropologists play? And just now we're talking about anthropologists in international organizations, in corporations. And I think there's lots more, in a way, to talk about in terms of the work anthropologists do, often not saying, I'm an anthropologist and that has informed why I do things in this way, but anthropologists get on with it but use their skills, their tools, which I think are unique in some respects in how we do our work. How reflective we are about our own position within the field, for instance. The tools like ethnography, like going out, talking to people, using that skill set to better the world. Not always, perhaps, but in any kind of way.
Better our understanding of the world, at least.
Well, we'll leave it on that very meta note in which anthropologists themselves learn about other anthropologists and their work. I think that's really wonderful. And on the topic of what we've learnt, we've made a final video for this course, Anthropology, World 101x, the Anthropology of Current World Issues, and we'll be releasing that video within a couple of hours. So if you want to have a look at
minutes,
within minutes, the internet, it's terrifyingly quick. But if you want to have a look back over, take a retrospective look back over the last 8 weeks of this course, which we've had so much fun putting together, then do be sure to check back in on the World 101x edX platform, and you can find that video in the course announcements. But aside from that, thank you so much for joining us. This was the final live stream for this course, World 101x. So Gerhard Hofstadter, Anna Christina Pertiera, Sally Babbage, thanks so much for being part of the panel, and thanks you to you all for tuning in and bringing us your questions and comments over the course.
Thank you.